Okay, welcome to our Patreon parishioners. Thank you for tuning in for another episode of bonus content. For this week's bonus content, we did another little scene study, compare and contrast between the Ten Commandments and the Prince of Egypt. We watched specifically the scenes that dealt with the plague that was the death of the firstborn.
Ooh,
if you haven't,
yeah.
You can find both these scenes on YouTube. If you just search like Ten Commandments, Death of the Firstborn, or Prince of Egypt, Death of the Firstborn, you can find them and you can watch them before listening to this bonus episode to have an idea of what we're talking about.
They weren't very dialogue heavy, so we decided not to actually play them during this because it would just be us sitting there for 3 minutes while there's like...
all of those weird music. So I guess, Emily, could you describe for us what happened in the Ten Commandments version of this scene? How did the Ten Commandments and Cecil B. DeMille handle the death of the firstborn?
I mean, he showed a lot of Yul Brynner going back and forth. Yeah, just being like, this is a bad time. And also seeming to get angry at his wife, who you said is apparently a person that Moses was connected to / in love with.
Yeah.
But then she ended up marrying the Pharaoh.
Yeah, in the Ten Commandments, there's this weird tension because it's like this woman is in love with Moses, but then Moses leaves, and so she ends up marrying Ramses, but then Ramses knows that she's still into Moses, and so there's like all this, love triangle tension.
Yeah, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so that was interesting and rough. And then, of course, like Moses comes to Pharaoh when Pharaoh is brooding with very little clothes on.
He's brooding, and he's like this perfect brooding. Listeners, you need to watch this.
He looks like the thinking man. He's so like built.
Yeah,
it's amazing.
Just any time that you need to like brood in front of a significant other, like it's like this perfect position to like show off your beefy arm muscles.
Yeah,
totally.
That's true.
It's like, look at my beefy arm muscles. No, don't look at me. I'm hideous. No, look at me. Yeah,
exactly.
It was kind of one of those things. And then Moses walked off talking about something. I don't really know what, but he walked off stage left, and he was just walking and talking, and nobody could really understand what he said. And then it was very sad. Pharaoh's wife walked in with their dead child and was like, he is dead. And that was the end.
Yeah.
And like Moses was like standing there in front of Pharaoh and then starts walking away while like proclaiming about the power of God and how God will lead his people out of Egypt, and like keeps talking to himself, and you can hear him like for like 2 minutes as he's walking further and further down the hallway.
What is
totally off camera.
What is he doing?
Right.
It's so strange.
No one's listening to him. He's all by himself down the hallway, and you hear him still echoing like, and God has such power, and it's just like weird. Really
just
weird.
In typical like Charlton Heston fashion. As I commented when we were watching like all of the Ten Commandments, and let me say I do love the Ten Commandments because I do think it is amazing, but just the style of acting back then, I guess it was all very stagey, I suppose, and like not a lot of nuance, not a lot of emotion, just a lot of like presentation.
I don't have much problem with like, I love stage shows.
Mm-hmm.
I'm fine with that. But it was fascinating, like just watching this man walk off stage left, like continuing to talk, and us being like, what was that? Like, why is he still talking? Like, with nobody focusing on him.
Yeah.
They're just focusing on Yul Brynner being brooding. It was very strange. Very strange indeed.
Well, let's talk about the Prince of Egypt then, which is very different from the tone of the Ten Commandments.
Yeah. Seriously.
So just for our listeners who, if you haven't watched already, like basically, first of all, I just have to say that this scene in The Prince of Egypt traumatized me as a child and like scared the crap out of me because it's very spooky.
Yeah.
It's just this like
super
weird, spooky mist that comes out of the sky and goes through the town and like goes into the houses that don't have the blood on them. And like there's no music, there's nothing underneath it. You just hear this like creepy breathing noise whenever a child dies.
Yeah, like rather than like screams or cries, it's just this like sound, and it's so disturbing. It's really creepy.
Yeah, it really scared me as a kid. But then cut to, they write in kind of a similar scene to the Ten Commandments where it's like Moses confronting Pharaoh after Pharaoh's child has died.
Yeah.
And it's way
and he
sadder.
Like tries to touch him, but Moses is like, don't touch me.
You mean Pharaoh?
That's the one, Pharaoh. Don't touch me.
Yeah, but in this one, it's like they're friends, and like Moses feels bad about it. Whereas
because they used to be brothers.
Right. Whereas the Charlton Heston one, he's sort of
Ah.
very know-it-all about it. Like,
Mhm.
oh, no, yes, well, and then I'm going to mutter to myself down this hallway.
Right.
But yeah, in Prince of Egypt, it's like seems very torn between wanting to like comfort Pharaoh, but also knowing that it's like because like not his fault per se, because God did it, but like you know what I mean, that he was involved and that God was doing this for him, and it hurt this person who he grew up with so much.
Yeah, and that scene ends. I don't know. I've always loved the fact that that scene ends where Moses walks out, not talking to himself,
Yeah.
but he walks out and immediately just like collapses crying, like sobbing.
Yeah, it's very
And
sad.
it's so, I remember that always sticking with me as a child because this story had always been painted for me as this very like straight up good versus evil story of like, you know, Moses says this and the Egyptians don't listen and so they get punished and then the Israelites are victorious until finally they get to go.
Right. Which is like the Charlton Heston version.
Exactly. That it was like,
Yeah.
oh no, this has an impact. Like it's still very
Mhm.
sad. And Moses is still very sad that it's like he's had to kind of indirectly be responsible for like the deaths of all these children, you know?
Yeah. I mean, it is pretty screwed up and
Yeah.
very, very scary. I can imagine. Like, I know I saw this movie as a kid, and I must have just been like, I don't know, whatever.
You're like, they're not singing it this part, so I'm not going to pay
Exactly.
attention.
I'm like, I sang the song, and I didn't even care about what was happening in the film.
Yeah, it was funny watching that scene together. Like, because when you talked about the, you know, killing of the firstborn in Prince of Egypt being creepy, I was like, sure, but I don't remember it at all. But then when we watched it, I was like, oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I remember
yeah.
being in the theater and watching this happen and like
Being like,
ooh,
Yeah.
geez.
And I think there's just something about like, I guess I appreciate any kind of biblical adaptation that like rather than focusing on the power of God, it kind of focuses on the human relationships
oh, yeah.
going
that.
because we don't get a ton of that in the Bible. Like it is all very presentational of like this happened, then this happened, then this happened. We don't get a lot of commentary on like how people felt about it necessarily.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea that it's like these really amazing and sometimes really scary and really awful things happen and it has an emotional impact. Like these people are actually human
sure.
beings.
Yeah, no, I think
Yeah.
So,
that's really
yeah.
interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. I've also been trying to look up some stuff about Passover because I feel embarrassed about how little we all knew about it in this episode.
I know. Will you talk to us about it, please?
Yeah, I mean, okay, like we covered most of it, right? It's this thing that happened. It's kind of weird because it's sort of billed as a celebration of God freeing his people from slavery in Egypt,
Oh.
but is like also
Okay.
tied to this very terrible event, this, you know,
Yeah.
most horrible of all the plagues, which is weird. One thing I did learn is that this original Passover happened about 1300 BCE.
Whoa.
So we are getting closer and closer to New Testament time, I guess.
Yeah.
Which is interesting. But let's see. What I've learned basically is, basically that a lot of things about this holiday have changed over the years, and that in different, what are they called? Like, not denominations, but like different sects of Judaism,
Different schools, sects of Judaism, schools of Judaism. Yeah.
Yeah, and then other kind of related religions, I guess, like Samaritans are brought up specifically, that there's like different dates that this will happen on in different calendars. One thing I did learn is that most Jews celebrate Passover for 7 days, but who are they? I've already blanked on it. The like more conservative Jews,
Like Orthodox Jews,
like the Orthodox
or
Jews,
Hasidic Jews.
the Hasidic and the
Yeah.
Orthodox Jews, it's actually 8 days.
Oh,
So I'm like, I
extra
don't
day.
know how that happened. Yeah, gotta
All right.
get that one more day in there. Yes. What was it? The other thing, this was interesting, is that some historians have maintained a hypothesis that there actually was this celebration already before
interesting.
this story in
Yeah.
Exodus was written, and that this was kind of like two separate things that got combined into one holiday, much in the same way that like Christmas kind of came about by like combining pagan holidays with Christian beliefs
Right.
and kind of making a new holiday. Obviously, many people disagree with that interpretation, but I did think that was pretty interesting that there's some kind of debate about all
Yeah.
of that. But yeah, anyway, it's interesting. And then there's, of course, like very technical rules about the type of sacrifice that needs to be made and
right.
differences between
Of course.
how it's done. Basically, like in modern day, it's not about sacrificing something and everyone having to eat it, but it's more about taking a certain portion of the food and kind of setting it aside and not eating it.
Yeah.
So there's it's definitely changed over time. But I did learn that we were correct in the way that we understood the amount of lambs that need to be sacrificed. And that
which is what, one?
So that you keep your lamb for a few days and then you sacrifice it and you eat it that night, which was the 15th of Nisan, which is the name of that month in the Jewish calendar. If the family was too small to finish eating the entire offering in one sitting, then an offering was made for a group of families. So that's kind of what Dedeker pointed out, of like, it's like, no, one lamb per however many people can eat it, basically, because they have to eat it all that night. I think
actually, now that we're talking about it, I know we talked about Eid a little bit, that yeah, it's kind of a similar thing with Eid, that it's like sometimes families will pool their resources like to buy a lamb that will get sacrificed, and then they'll split the meat between themselves. But I think on Eid, you don't have to like eat the whole thing that same day. It's just about the sacrifice.
Yeah, it was also interesting that this pointed out something that I thought about while we were reading, which was the whole unleavened thing, that in the Bible story...
Yeah, there was unleavened all over the place.
Well, but that in the Bible story, God's like, and you better eat unleavened stuff during this time. And then the story goes, they had to leave in a hurry and they couldn't leaven their bread. And, when I was looking into this, it's like, well, we eat unleavened bread because in fleeing from Egypt, they didn't have time to leaven their bread. And so we're kind of doing it in remembrance of that. But it's kind of one of those things, like maybe like we talked about with the Binding of Isaac, where did someone come in kind of later and then write in that like God specified that too, rather than just we do this because we're kind of remembering what it was like at this time when our people fled and couldn't leaven their bread. That is interesting that like the story was, I remember reading it being like, wait, which is it? Did they not leaven their bread because God told them, or because they had to flee in a hurry? Like, what's the deal?
Right.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for doing that Passover research.
Yes, I feel slightly better.
Just slightly. It's okay. We'll
bit.
Still get the tweets from the people who know much more about this than we do.
I hope so. We deserve
And that's
them.
okay. We welcome it. Yeah. Well, thank you again, patron parishioners, for tuning in, and we will see you next week.